Hello, Dr. Tesler Stein. How are you doing today?
I'm good. It's good to be here.
Thank you so much for coming to share your wisdom on perinatal bereavement. Um, I would love to start by asking you, what is National Grief Awareness Week and why is it important?
So this week is National Grief Awareness Week, and I love some of these awareness holidays and time frame, not because this is the only time we should be thinking about grief and grieving, but because it is a nice way to draw attention to the reality that there are so many people anywhere and everywhere there that are somewhere in a grief process, who are bereaved, and we forget, right? I mean,
Mm,
I think like right in the aftermath of a death, of a major loss, we're there, we're connected, we're engaged, um, and then as happens, the world continues to turn, the sun continues to rise and set, and our lives continue. And it can be easy to forget that the process of mourning is ongoing,
mm,
and that there are sometimes predictable times when people are going to feel it more strongly, feel that wave, and also unpredictable times. So it's just nice to draw attention to it as a reminder. But like most of the things that we do here at Touchstone, I think that the fact is that we try and work very hard to be mindful um, about some of these really important issues all the weeks of the year, as much as possible, um, and also on special weeks like this.
You mentioned the holidays, and for some people, there are important holidays for them coming up.
Hmm.
Do you have any thoughts about the clinicians who are working with these families who might have lost a
Hmm.
child
Yeah,
and what it looks like for them?
yeah, yeah. And holidays are one of the predictable periods where people can absolutely get those more intense waves of grief, and along with things like anniversaries, birthdays, things like that. Um, you know, the it so much depends on what the family dream has been and
Mm,
what the family traditions have been, um, and how much imagining of the future a family parents have done. So, for example, there may have been a longed for experience of lighting the Hanukkah menorah for the first time, right, with a new baby, or baby's first menorah, or something, or dreidel, which is the top that we spin as a game during Hanukkah, or for those who celebrate Christmas, where there's decorations, where there's traditional foods also with Hanukkah. And I'm just naming two of the holidays that are in this time period. The fantasies, the imagining, the normal stuff, right? Of these traditional things that maybe I did as a child, that I now want to do with my child, and now I don't have my child home to share in these experiences. And so the absence of that baby, and then in subsequent years of that toddler, of that preschooler, of that elementary school age kid, um, is noticed, is felt, particularly when there are perhaps cousins around the same age that are there and that are growing up, and then the absence of this baby who died is still felt. The space where that baby should have been, could have been, would have been. And so for a lot of families, a lot of parents who are in this space, remembering that that's happening is incredibly helpful and supportive. Even finding a moment, maybe not in the middle of dinner, depending on your family dynamic, but to say, I'm thinking about you too. And I want you to know that I was imagining and I was remembering. And, I'm so glad you're here, and I wish that he would have been able to be here too. Whatever, but the affirming, the remembering, the naming of it instead of the silence,
Mm.
um, can make a huge difference for families. And permission to mention the child who isn't there is also huge. It's not going to take over everything. It's a way of affirming that this child was wanted and loved and is missed.
Um, this training that is upcoming that you're going to be doing with Dr. Debbie Davis.
Yes.
Why was the book originally necessary?
Well, the first edition of Empty Cradle, Broken Heart, Surviving the Death of Your Baby, was written in the 80s. No, yeah, it was starting to be researched in the 80s. I think the first edition came out in the early 90s. And at that time, there was almost nothing available for bereaved parents of infants, of newborns, that was emotionally supportive, psychologically minded, filled with the voices of parents and their experiences, and wasn't afraid of the topic. So, one of the things that really has made Empty Cradle, Broken Heart uh, such a standout resource for decades now are those factors, I think. I tell the story of how I found the book. And it was in a bookstore where back in the days when you could like sit in a cushy chair and have a pile of books next to you, right? And a cup of coffee. And I was looking for books on bereavement. And there at that point, this was already in the late 90s, there was a pile of books on bereavement, but they were all very kind of sterile, or they were personal narratives. So it was one person's story, which is can be very supportive to people as well. But the only book I left with was Empty Cradle, Broken Heart. And this was before I knew Debbie. It's actually sort of how I ended up meeting Debbie. Because it wasn't afraid of the topic, because it was written with such a gentle but authoritative voice, but that drew from the lived experience of these parents that had been interviewed over many years. And so it was there to support families, and families really embraced it as a way to understand what was happening to them. Because it's so easy to feel alone, and it's so easy to feel crazy when you're grieving.
Absolutely. And, to that end, that makes me think that there are therapists who do this work very specifically.
Yeah.
So they go to trainings, they read the books, and then I feel like there's this other branch of therapists who might be working with a client, and there happens to be a loss.
Yeah.
And because they're well bonded and they're doing good work together, it's not
Yeah.
necessarily appropriate to say, go see that person over
No, right.
So, what kinds of things should the latter part of those um, people be looking at in terms of trainings um, and readings and just experiences?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I always recommend Empty Cradle, Broken Heart, not just for parents, but for practitioners, because while it can be helpful to know what the literature says, very often what we're looking at in the literature are what they're researching really are interventions at the hospital level, and looking at, so for example, like what kinds of protocols are helpful to families post stillbirth, post miscarriage, post premature birth, or medically compromised infant who dies in newborn intensive care. And so what, looking at like the larger systems and what to put into place, or they're looking at sort of rates of depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder post medical complication in pregnancy. But really, and that's really important stuff to know. It's important to understand what happens for families in the hospital. But I really think that listening to the voices of families, and really hearing what this experience is and getting comfortable clinically with people talking about dying babies, dead babies, bereaved parents, um, and being able to sit really comfortably, openly with families who are in that place is the most important thing that you can do. Understanding that those parents are parents, no matter when that baby died. And certainly we wanna evoke and help parents to say for themselves how they see themselves, particularly when you're looking at something like an earlier miscarriage. Um, and also, very often parents don't necessarily think of themselves as parents because they don't think they're allowed to, if they didn't bring a baby home. So we can make space for that. You're parenting a baby during pregnancy. When you're taking care of your body, when you're, attentive to what's happening, when the pregnant person is following up, uh, and eating and drinking well, resting well, all of these things. This is the beginning of that attunement. It's that beginning, and we know that bonding begins uh, during the course of pregnancy. So for clinicians to understand that, and to sit with that, so that the grief can move, and it will ebb and flow, because that's what grief does. It's very messy. It is in no way linear, or predictable. But making enough space for that process, will allow that therapeutic process to begin, and will also allow you and the client to begin to see, is there something happening here that is stuck, where there's something that has gotten wounded in a way that maybe feels more than about grieving, a mobilized grieving process. Um, but I think that um, there's quite a bit of support, I think, in the therapeutic community, to learn about perinatal bereavement, to learn about how to best support families, how to help people with what Debbie and I call the 3 core tasks, which parents face in a perinatal trauma, which have to do with one's sense of self with regard to this baby, with managing all of the feelings, including grief and trauma that come up, and managing all of the interlocking relationships that are complicated, that include the relationship with your partner, the relationship with extended family, the relationship with the baby, and the relationship with the medical profession. And so, as clinicians, we're in a position to help people to orient to what's happening to them, and what may be happening to their partner or to the grandparents, right? Or to the siblings, if there's siblings in the family already, to understand what's happening, and then therapeutically to help with an understanding of what this experience means to people, and how to ask those questions, how to be receptive to those answers. So, Empty Cradle is a great book. I have a whole long list of resources. There's some wonderful personal stories that are very well written about very different kinds of situations that families go through. And certainly there are lots and lots of trainings on perinatal bereavement, including the one Debbie and I will be doing at the end of January.
I'm definitely looking forward to another round of that. Um,
Us too.
you know, it makes me think about the 3 core tasks, right? Because as you're talking about how people are creating their relationship to this child that has already started, one of the phrases that has started coming up a lot, um, that I always listen for, right? I want to name it
Mhm.
what the client is naming it is phrases like, I know I only have one living child, but I have two.
Yes. Yes. Absolutely. And this is a big identity piece. This question, like, when you meet somebody new and they say, how many children do you have? For many people, particularly early on after a child dies, or an infant dies, and it's more so with infants, because very often those infants don't make it home. So it's this, I have a baby, really, I had a baby, here's pictures, right? But maybe almost nobody got to meet the baby. The baby died in utero, the baby died at delivery. If a baby died in newborn intensive care, where, they were quarantined, particularly with COVID, it was much, much more restrictive even than it typically is. Um, this question of how many children do I have? Like, do I really want to have this conversation in the middle of the grocery store with somebody I just met or haven't seen since high school, or whatever the thing is? And you hear parents say, like, okay, so I have two choices. I could lie and then feel like I've betrayed my baby, or I could rip my guts out, and fall apart. And so the conversation, clinically in therapy, is often about, like, that you can make that decision to say, I'm not actually going to have this conversation here in the profile, because I need to protect myself. I need to take care of myself. And that doesn't have to be, oh no, I have betrayed my baby. It can be, I don't need to give this person this amount of vulnerability right here, at 10 o'clock at night going grocery shopping. Um, because I know about this baby. I haven't forgotten this baby. I'm not ignoring this baby. It's really just the cost of sharing the information. Other times people worry about the impact on the person who's asked. Oh, this poor person. They have no idea, what they just stepped on. And yet it's the not talking about it that makes those sorts of revelations, I think, feel more overwhelming
Mm.
than they might otherwise be. I mean, it's never a happy piece of news to share, but it's a meaningful piece of information to share.
Yeah,
So,
that
yeah,
isolation. I feel like we might need to develop just better strategies as I mean, we work with people from all over, from all sorts of different backgrounds and cultures, where there might be some things that are relevant to this, but just to be able to say something like, thank you for sharing that with me.
yeah, I didn't know what was their name, right?
Absolutely.
And that's really powerful, right? That baby existed. That baby had a name, has a name.
Um, I know so I've heard you previously refer to just some specific cultural practices
Mm,
that either help or potentially at times become barriers for people
mhm.
in practices that can help with healing, or just all of the different ways that cultures, religions experience this. Do you have any insights on that for us?
Yeah, what works for one family or one person in a family may not work so well for somebody else. And that's just something to just know that, and even within the same sort of cultural ritual or religious ritual, there may be elements that are really powerful and important for one person, and really difficult for someone else. I think that the structure and prescriptive nature of cultural and religious ritual can be incredibly anchoring for people in the aftermath, or even in the midst of one of the most overwhelming kinds of crises that anybody could ever imagine. So there's something about We need to get the rabbi or the priest or the imam. We need to get, have this or that happen, that can be soothing, that can be orienting, that can remind people that they're connected to a larger, older community, which can be very helpful for some people. Now, for other people, if they've had um, painful experiences in cultural groups or religious community, that can be very tricky. The prescriptive rules or guidelines, for some people. And so clinically, when you're thinking about what do we do now, if you're in the same culture as your client or the same religious group as your client, remember that there's going to be diversity within those groups as well. And what one group does or one subgroup does may differ somewhat from what another group does. So to say to somebody, what would be meaningful to you here
Mm.
in this period? What do you think? And are there things that your family has done, that your community does, that are religiously structured, that appeal to you, that seem to you to be things that would be helpful here? And for some people, they'd be like, it doesn't matter, we're doing them anyway. Okay, and also, can you still think about the things you're going to do because this is what you do? Can you think about what is particularly meaningful to you that you can really dig into in a way that is more personal to you? So it might be a eulogy. It might be the particular words on a headstone. It might be a name. It might be the name itself. Names are so meaningful, and how a name is given and who gives the name and who chooses it, how it's chosen, what it's meant to convey is powerful. So, the rituals around time, the rituals around memorializing, um, and, so both affirming these religious or cultural positioning while also planting those seeds for, and this can also be personally meaningful. You can choose and gravitate even more so towards one or more of the things that, again, even if you're going to do them anyway, that you can sort of own some of them for yourself, and
I
maybe they're different for different family members.
Yeah, I love that description because it's considering not only cultural and religious factors, but maybe familial factors and
Yeah.
individual desires. There are, I think, some really nice things that are now happening in hospitals where there's like this encouragement of saying, "Hey, you might actually want this professionally taken picture
Yes. Yes.
afterwards. Maybe you don't want to look at it for a year, but you might want."
Exactly. Exactly. Because this is the thing about bereavement photography, is that you don't get another chance. So to say, here's something that we can do. I know it must sound like a wild and crazy idea right now. Um, parents, many parents that I've spoken to have been so glad they did this.
Mm.
Um, are you open? Do, do you give permission? And then a good bereavement photographer is like a fly on the wall. They're not posing people. They're not in the way. They really are meant to be, very much over here, really capturing the relationship and the love that's happening in the room, whatever is
That
happening there.
that's respect.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
understood.
yeah. And capturing that is really priceless, I think.
So, for people who attend this your upcoming training, one of your
Mm,
upcoming trainings, because you are also very soon doing an EMDR foundational
I am. I'm excited.
Tell us about the outcomes for both of them, what people will leave knowing.
Ah, so so let me start with Empty Cradle. So this training is such a gift to teach because I teach it with Debbie Davis, who is just a gem of a human being and is just brimming with so much compassion and insight and wisdom. And she's a developmental psychologist and a writer. Um, so she does this work with a lot of community work, a lot of advocacy work, a lot of work in support groups over the years, and certainly interviewing families. And then both bereaved families, and then later parents of premature babies, which was the research that she and I did together later. Um, so getting to teach with Debbie means that we get to riff with each other, which is endlessly interesting because both of us continue to read and to learn and to talk to people and to be thinking about all the layers of these experiences. What does it mean to be a parent? What does it mean to be in a family? What happens when a baby dies? What happens when you need to make decisions about medical decisions for a baby, for a critically ill baby, in utero or after birth? Um, how do we encourage the medical setting to best really facilitate collaboration with families? We just all these questions, and then we're continuing to live our lives and have our own further life experiences and celebrations and losses and more experiences as life continues and life goes on and kids grow and families expand and contract and all of those things. And so we just sort of keep layering in new insights and new observations and just sort of new nuances. And so it just never gets stale. It's kind of a remarkable thing. And so people will leave with a lot of facts and information, a lot of actionable, how do I do this? But I think most critically, the thing that Debbie and I really do together is really think about, talk with people and each other about, how do I think about this?
Mm.
Because if you can leave with a framework, a flexible, comprehensive framework for understanding the phenomena that you're experiencing and the dialogue and what parents are telling you, then it doesn't matter what the particulars are of the pregnancy complications or the illness or what happened to the baby. What you're going to listen for are going to be um, kinds of phenomenon that fall into the, how do I think about this? What am I looking for here? How do I understand this? And so then it's easier not to get caught up in too much detailed content as a way to think, okay, what do I need to do now? But I'm listening. I'm listening for grief. I'm listening to see if grief is mobilized. I'm listening to see, where can I best support a grieving process? How do I strengthen that process? Because grief is about love, and it's about integrating the person who's gone in a way that is alive and sustainable internally and family. Um, and how do I think about trauma? How do I understand where trauma is threaded through these experiences in a way that leaves people bleeding all the time, and that leaves actually interferes with the process of mourning? Because you can't really be grieving if you are falling into a trauma experience over and over again. When you're really into re-experiencing, which is how we neurologically think about what happens with trauma. So helping clinicians to be able to make those distinctions, or begin to ask the questions that will help them make those distinctions, leaves people with really flexible, applicable tools. And that's the goal. um, alongside, this is what this looks like, this is what this sounds like, this is why this happens, this is the neurobiology. Here's how to support, and then here's how to treat. Um, we're supporting is really supporting an already healthy, mobilized process, and helping to buffer anything that might interfere. Whereas the more treatment orientation is where, oh, something is stuck actually, or somebody has come in already vulnerable, already wounded, and then this happens. And so now we've got layers and layers and layers. How do I think about this most recent in the context of what maybe somebody has come in with?
Well, and I have had the benefit of seeing this training a couple of times, and what I'll say is that I always leave with a new piece of information. So,
Mm,
lots of therapists who are working with um, different types of losses, and when I'm having these conversations with them, they'll say, I'll have a lot, I do have a lot of experience, and I'll say something like, that's great. Do you know what palliative care looks like for a 1 month old? And they'll say, oh no, I've never had that experience. And I'll say, me either. But this is why I love to be in these spaces.
mm-hmm.
To be
Yes.
learning about experiences that I have not had professionally.
Yeah.
So I'm that much better equipped when that client walks through my door.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. The vocabulary is deeper, the knowledge base is broader. Um, and one of the things that Debbie has done quite a bit is really looking at and talking about um, the medical ethics around decision making and collaborative care with families, and then
Yes.
also looking at perinatal hospice, which is, um, an avenue that I think is becoming more accessible for families. People are understanding it better, and there's still a lot of work to do in this country, but and around the world. But perinatal hospice is this process where a family receives an in utero diagnosis of a condition that is likely to be or is definitely life limiting, meaning that fetus is likely to die either in utero, at birth, or shortly after birth. And the options are, if where the options are, um, pregnancy termination where that's available, to people, or the continuation of this pregnancy wherever it's going to end, however it's going to end, with real support and intentionality about what that's about, and how families are continuing to stay connected to that developing fetus, what's meaningful to them, what they want, uh, whether they can have it or not depends not on them generally,
Right.
um, but and what are the things that are important to you, and let's try to, if at all possible, to make possible that you can have those things. Um, and which brings us also to, so perinatal hospice is one branch, and then the other might be termination because of a medical reason, either having to do with the fetus or with the pregnant person. And when a pregnancy and a baby is wanted and intentional, um, those losses are are absolutely devastating. It's a choice between horrible and terrible.
Yes. Yes, definitely. Um, and I think that the content in that training is amazing. And that is for both EMDR practitioners and non EMDR practitioners.
Yes, yes, yes. I
And
like
then,
to teach the foundational frame for that we teach in EMDR, that is not anything to do with the method, that is all about how we understand the
yes,
neurobiology, because I think it's useful for all clinicians. So as an EMDR, if you're an EMDR practitioner and you come to this workshop, we're going to be speaking that language. And then if you're not an EMDR practitioner, you're going to learn enough of that language and then, be sharing with the rest of the practitioners. So it doesn't matter, or if you're a brain spotting practitioner, by the way, or really any sort of trauma-focused therapist. There's community and space for conversation in the training.
I love that. But so for people who will be blown away by some of this content, and then will then say, "Oh, now I'm interested in doing EMDR with my
Ah,
parents."
yes.
Where do those people go?
Well, we have an EMDR basic training. We call it our foundational EMDR training. It's the first course that a clinician takes to begin to become an EMDR practitioner. It is 2 3-day blocks. That's still one course. And there's also 10 hours of consultation that are required to complete the foundational course for EMDR. We offer that twice a year, and we like to hold these trainings specifically inviting clinicians who work with the perinatal population, so that our demonstration of techniques and the model and the method can focus on topics that are specifically perinatal topics. So rather than doing a demo of somebody who had a car accident or an assault, it may be a stillbirth, or it may be a traumatic birth that we're reprocessing or resourcing, or other things that we do with EMDR therapy. So and then the conversations and questions, it's like you're talking to your people, so that we're all. I mean, I've had the experience over the last 30 years of being a therapist so many times going to advanced trainings, and I'm the only one in the room who works with this population. And people will be like, oh, that's very interesting. you know there's only so many times you can talk about dead babies before people do not want to go to lunch with you. So it's very nice to have our community together, and we can talk about all the things, and know that we're in good company, having these experiences. And people who are interested in perinatal mental health, doesn't have to be bereavement. Maybe you're more interested in perinatal mood and anxiety. Maybe you're more interested in infertility. Maybe you're more interested in birth trauma in particular, but don't have a lot of experience. We're very, very warm and welcoming. We just, envelop you and say, welcome. And here we'll teach you all the things, and we'll support you in your development, because we need you, we want you. We're happy you're here.
Absolutely. Well, Mara, thank you so much for sharing that with us, and we'll make sure to link to the upcoming trainings and also
Awesome.
link to information on um, National Grief Awareness Week.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. And I hope to see people online, and in conversation and in trainings and in future Tuesday teas.
Excellent. Take good care.
Take care. Bye bye.